You'll often face the challenge that the Bible can't be trusted because it's not true history. It's a mixture of error and fables. You will have all met that at some point or another. Generally, the reason for this claim is simply that these people have either never seriously studied the Bible, or they simply accept what they've been told. It's what we may call fake information. What I'm going to do this evening is focus right down on one particular area. I'm going to narrow down to one writer of the New Testament. It may surprise you to know that Luke actually wrote 27% of our New Testament. And I want to use him as an example of what you can do throughout the Bible books that relate to history. Because if Luke is shown to be a reliable historian in his Gospel and Acts, we can trust his record of the life of Jesus and the early Christian church. Check his history, and what you can't check, you can legitimately trust. Having said that, I want to introduce you to someone else first. This name may mean nothing to you. Sir Charles William Ramsey, we call him William Ramsey, that's how he was known. He was an archaeologist, a bucket and spade archaeologist, digging around. He spent his academic life digging around in Asia Minor. Now that's modern day Turkey. Asia Minor and Greece, that's the land of Paul and his missionary travels, as well as the Gospel of Luke. Now he was a very bright guy, there's no question about that, as you'll see if you just scan your eyes down some of his many qualifications. He was a professor at Oxford and Aberdeen. He gained many honorary doctorates, and as a matter of fact, he was knighted in 1906 for his service to archaeology. And his literary output was just phenomenal. It's very hard sometimes to gather all the material together that he wrote. Now, he was no mean scholar, and he was and still is the foremost authority on Luke as a historian. But I want you to see where he started, because this is important. He studied under a man called Ferdinand Bauer, a founder of the Tübingen University in Germany. Now that name may mean nothing to you, and nor the university, although it's still there. But the important thing is that Ramsey accepted Bauer's view that the New Testament could not be relied on as a historical document, and that there were huge differences between the theology of Paul and Peter. In fact, he went on to admit that he, in his words, worshipped Wellhausen. Now, Wellhausen was a German scholar who was just the same as Ferdinand Bauer, only with the Old Testament. He dismissed entirely the historical accuracy of the Old Testament. So here we are. This is what he expected to find when he started digging around in Asia Minor and Greece. But it's not how he concluded. Half a century researching in the land of Paul's travels, Ramsey concluded this: Luke wrote with such judgment, skill, art, and perception of truth as to be a model of historical statement. I set out to look for truth on the borderland where Greece and Asia met, and found it there in the Acts of the Apostles. He actually went on to say, you may press the words of Luke in a degree beyond any other historians, and they stand the keenest scrutiny and the hardest treatment. Christianity did not originate in a lie, and we can and ought to demonstrate this as well as believe it. Therefore, you are never going to be out of place when you quote Ramsey. But here's the interesting thing. Professor F.F. Bruce and many other evangelical scholars have noticed how often critics raise issues against the New Testament as if William Ramsey never existed. They're either ignorant of his massive work, or they choose to ignore the final answers he gave to their criticisms. You'll never go wrong if you can quote Ramsey. And he really has a lot to teach us. Luke has never been shown to be inaccurate. and much of his history matches exactly with known texts and inscriptions of the 1st century. And we'll look at that in a moment. You may just like to scan through this. In his Gospel and Acts, Luke refers to 114 identifiable places, 25 political, military, social, or religious events, all of them known to history. He refers to the famine in Judea in Acts 11 and the expulsion of the Jews from Rome in Acts 18, both of them found in 1st century texts. There's no question that they happened. And he refers to 117 living people by name. Now, many of these are well known. We'll look at a few of them this evening. Some are not, of course. They're just ordinary people that we can't check up on. But here's the thing. Luke must have kept a record, and he was very happy for readers to check him out. I believe Luke had a notebook. And you say, a notebook in the 1st century? Yes, a notebook in the 1st century. This is a 1st century notebook. Now, if you take a few slithers of wood, very thin, or parchment, punch a hole in the bottom and put a ring through them, you've made a ring binder. That was 1st century technology, just before they invented what is known as a codex, or what we call books. It was a wonderful invention. Now, it was so new that the Greeks had no name for it. So they used the Latin word membrane, from which, of course, we get our word membrane. Did you know Paul was using a notebook? When Paul wrote to Timothy in 2 Timothy 4:13 and asked him to bring some of his goods to him, his cloak and so on, he particularly says, oh, and don't forget my scrolls. And then you'll notice what he says, especially the parchments. Now, that's the English translation of the word that is there in your Greek New Testament, but it's not a Greek word, it's the word membrane. Paul was using a notebook. So if Paul was, why shouldn't Luke have been using a notebook? Look, we really will get to Luke in a moment, but I need to introduce you to somebody else. Simon Greenleaf. Simon Greenleaf was one of the founders of the Harvard Law School in the USA, a very famous law school even today. And he wrote a treatise on the law of evidence, nothing to do with the Bible, though he was a believer. And this is a book that is still used today. It is considered to be one of the greatest authorities on the law of evidence. And what Greenleaf then did was to actually apply the law of evidence to the Gospels, the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, under 5 headings. And these 5 headings would still hold in a court of law today. First of all, documents, and that's what the Gospels are, have a right to be taken as a true record unless proven otherwise. Secondly, the author has a right to be considered trustworthy unless proven otherwise. Third, the number of independent witnesses confirms the greater accuracy of the report. 4, the agreement of their evidence enhances the truth of the record. And 5, their reliability is confirmed by known events. Now, just apply those for a moment to the New Testament. The New Testament Gospels, the 4 Gospels, have never been proven inaccurately, never been proven inaccurate. That's not a matter of wishful thinking. It's proof that we should be looking for. So people have to prove it's inaccurate. They can't simply dismiss it. They have to prove it's inaccurate. Secondly, the author has a right to be considered trustworthy unless proven otherwise. The writers were men of known integrity. There is nothing ever in history's record that touches them against their integrity. You have to prove that they're men who lie. Thirdly, the number of independent witnesses confirms the greater accuracy of the 4 Gospels. You know, it's interesting, isn't it? If God had given us just one gospel, the critics would simply say, Well, of course, that's just Luke's view, or that's just Matthew's view. We've only got one gospel. So what does God do? He gives us four. So what do the critics do? They spend all their time trying to find minute differences between the two, between the four, and then assume they're all errors. You can't win with people who are dead set on trying to dispense with the Bible, but you have to prove that they are different. They are different, but that is not necessarily contradictory. None of them are. And then the agreement of their evidence enhances the truth of the record. Well, they never contradict each other. Oh, of course, people will say they do, but all the supposed contradictions have been answered many, many times. You can be sure of that. There are no contradictions. And their reliability is known by confirmed events. The historical details of the Gospels are confirmed, many of them, by known history. And we'll have a little look at that as we go along. So let's start with Luke's Gospel. We'll not spend too long with his Gospel, but see how accurate he wants to be. He says, I looked for eyewitnesses. I carefully investigated. I want you to have certainty. Now, this man is either an inveterate liar about which there is absolutely no proof, or he's telling the truth. He was an accurate historian. And as we've already seen, that's exactly what Ramsey came to the conclusion with. And then if you come to the Acts of the Apostles, he refers back to the Gospel of Luke. In my former book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and to teach. So the Acts of the Apostles is what Jesus continued to do and teach. And he says there were many convincing proofs. In other words, Luke claims to be a very accurate historian. He has never been shown to be inaccurate, and much of his history matches with known texts and inscriptions of the first century. Let's begin right at the beginning of Luke in those well-known Christmas verses. Now, the bits I've put in blue and have underlined actually present us with one or two problems, easy to dispense with, but people deny them. In the Roman world. Now, Ramsey showed that the Romans, like any efficient government, had regular censuses of their people. People said, oh, you know, the Romans didn't take a census of their people. Well, actually they did. And he lists a whole list of censuses that the Romans took. How else do you think they're going to know how to tax their people? They took regular censuses. And the word world there is not the word cosmos, it's a different word, and it can mean a limited area. It might simply mean the Roman world of Judea, or a bit wider than that. It doesn't have to mean the whole Roman Empire, though there's no reason why it might not. But here's the big problem, Quirinius. You see, Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to his own town to register, so we are told. Quirinius was involved in 2 censuses, and people will often challenge you and say, but Luke made a mistake with Quirinius because he was only involved in the one in Acts, and he wasn't involved in the one in Luke. Josephus, the Jewish historian, at the same time of the apostles, actually, he was contemporary with the apostle Paul, agrees with a census around 6 BC. But he claims that a man called Sentius Saturninus was the administrative governor of Syria. So how could Quirinius be involved in it? Well, if I can cut short a long and complicated explanation that Ramsey gives with all his backup of inscriptions, the answer is quite simple. Quirinius was actually the senior military governor in a dual control with Sentius Saturninus during the 2 censuses, certainly the first one. But Quirinius was actually away on military duty. He was fighting some terrorists actually on the borderland of Galatia. But he was the senior of the 2 because he was the military governor. And therefore it was quite natural that he was the one who actually ordered the census, even if perhaps Sentius Saturninus actually carried it out. The problem is quite easily solved. What about everyone going to his own town to register? Can you imagine every time our government wants to censor the nation, we all have to go back to where we were born? Have a spare bedroom for me down there in Barnstaple, please, because I've got to go back down there and actually have my census taken there. No. In those days, people weren't traveling so far from home as they do now. And in fact, this is a parchment of a Roman census order in Egypt by Gaius Maximus, who was the Roman governor of Egypt in AD 104 in the time of the Emperor Trajan. And he's ordering all men to return to their home for a census. So nothing unusual in that. That was a fairly common thing and people expected it. Now, have you ever wondered why Luke bothers to give us these names of all these people when John the Baptist began preaching? A bit unnecessary, wasn't it? Did we need to know it was in the time of Tiberius, Caesar, Pontius Pilate, Herod the Tetrarch of Galilee, Philip, Tetrarch of Iridua, and Trachonitis, Lysanias, Tetrarch of Abilene? Oh, and Annas and Caiaphas were the high priests. Did we need to know it? Precisely because he wants you to know that everything he writes is fixed in real history. This is rooted in time. Oh, but wait a moment. What about the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas? You can't have two high priests, can you? Well, sort of no, but sort of yes. You see, Annas was appointed high priest in AD 6, but he was deposed in AD 15 for incompetence and a few other things. But he remained in power as the power behind the throne when his son-in-law Caiaphas was appointed. It's interesting, you see, because actually Luke is making a point. The entire household of Annas and Caiaphas was pretty well hated because of their misdeeds and their greed. And Luke is making a point that we don't have just one high priest, we have two, because Annas is really the power behind the throne. It's a very significant little aside. And what about Pilate? Well, we did know about Pilate, to be fair, from inscriptions outside of the Bible. But here are two little pieces of hard evidence from archaeology. What you're looking at on the right-hand side there is a lump of stone that was an inscription on it found in Caesarea Maritima. That's on the coast. Don't confuse it with Caesarea Philippi in the Bible as well. Caesarea on the coast was the actual Roman headquarters. And in the 1950s, this inscription was discovered. It was originally from a temple dedicated to Tiberius by Pilate. That's what the actual inscription says. Unfortunately, in the 3rd century, they remodeled it to make it into a theatre, and it was ended up as a lump of stone on a stairway. But when that was demolished, it came to light. Oh, and the little bronze coin minted in Jerusalem by Pilate. So there's no question about Pilate. Now, as an aside here, something you can watch for in the New Testament when you're reading it. Have you ever wondered about this? Twice, Luke in his gospel refers to an argument that was started among the disciples as to which of them would be the greatest. Not once, but twice. Can you imagine the disciples of Jesus arguing about who would be greatest in Jesus's kingdom? Well, even more amazing is the fact that Luke records it. Isn't that something, if you were making up a story or even recording the history, you'd want to keep it quiet, wouldn't you? You see, Luke set out to be scrupulously honest. That's why in the same chapter, Luke 22, he actually gives record of Peter's tragic denial of Jesus. Now, when you're reading your Gospels, watch for these little details of authentic writing as you read the New Testament. Things that you would find yourself saying, that has to be written firsthand, because why else would you write it? Now for the Acts of the Apostles. It's packed with historical references, so we can just skim over a few. And you may be interested to know, by the way, Luke was a travel companion for most of Paul's travels. It starts really in Acts chapter 16, where Luke says, we got ready to leave for Macedonia. And the we comes in quite often later on because he was with them. Now, you may be interested why and how William Ramsey, starting out believing that Luke was wrong everywhere, changed his mind. Well, what changed his mind was something you'd probably never thought about. In Acts chapter 14 and verse 6, Paul and Barnabas fled to Iconium. From Iconium to the cities of Lystra and Derbe, the cities of Lystra and Derbe. Now, this implies they crossed a frontier because it was believed that Iconium was in fact in the chief city of Lycaonia. So it's a little bit like Luke wrote, somebody left London to go to England. And you'd think, well, he didn't know his geography very well. Didn't he know London was in England? And that's where it stood. A simple mistake like that. Luke didn't realize that actually Lystra and Derbe were in Iconium, in the same area as Iconium. Luke had made a historical error until Ramsey discovered that until the year A372, Iconium was not in Lycaonia at all. It belonged to Phrygia, an entirely different district of Asia Minor with an entirely different language. And actually, Luke brings that out in Acts as well, that they spoke in a different language. And when Ramsey found that, he thought to himself, well, I wonder if Luke is as meticulously accurate elsewhere. And that's exactly what he discovered. Luke records in Acts 12 the death of Herod Agrippa I. And he gives these details that you're looking at on the screen there. As a matter of fact, Josephus, the Jewish historian, has exactly the same record of his death. He adds a few little details to it. The sun was shining on Herod's clothes. Luke doesn't mention that. The people worshipped him as a god. Luke does mention that. Herod accepted this. He does mention that. And Josephus says he saw an owl as an evil omen. Luke doesn't mention that. He suffered violent stomach pains and died 5 days later. Luke dismisses it by saying an angel of the Lord struck him and he was eaten by worms and died. I think Luke's got it a little bit more graphic than Josephus, but you can see it's exactly the same account that they're talking about, and nothing there actually it differs in terms of the fact of the case. Now, when you're reading through the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles, you may get a bit confused with the Herods, Herod the Great, Herod Antipas, son of Herod the Great, Herod Agrippa II. Don't worry about them. We're not going to look at them now. Just take it from me, Luke gets them all in the correct place at the correct time. He is a very accurate historian. We can get muddled up, but he doesn't. And then we come to Paul. Paul, of course, stood by, as you know, while Stephen was being stoned. And he counted himself the foremost of sinners because that's something he never forgot. When Paul and Barnabas arrived on Cyprus, it is interesting that Luke particularly records that the proconsul, and he gets the title right, was called Sergius Paulus. He calls him an intelligent man. Well, he responded positively to the gospel, so of course he was an intelligent man. Interestingly, an inscription was discovered in 1877 near Paphos on Cyprus, confirming that Sergius Paulus was proconsul in AD 47, exactly when Paul and Barnabas were there. And from there, they moved on to Lystra. Now, most of you will know what happened at Lystra. Paul was given, by the grace of God, the ability to heal a man who was particularly ill. And immediately the people went into a frenzy. They said, the gods have come down to us in human form. And they called Barnabas Zeus, and they called Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. And they all started to worship them until Paul stopped them and said, hey, no, you're not to do this. Why did they respond like that? Well, there's a little story behind it that Luke would have known. Legend told of the time when Jupiter, the chief of all the Roman gods, that's Zeus to the Greeks, was ready to destroy mankind because none of them were generous. They were all a mean, mealy-mouthed lot. And he came to Lystra with Mercury, that's Hermes to the Greeks, the messenger who leads the souls to Hades. And they dressed as weary travelers, and only a very poor couple living in a little hovel, Philemon and Baucis, gave them hospitality. So as a reward, they were turned into 2 beautiful trees in this wonderful new kingdom, and the rest of the people were punished. Now, that's a little background story that Luke would have known, and he'd have known exactly why the people responded like they did. They were terrified that when Paul and Barnabas had healed a man, the gods had come back again, and they didn't want to be caught out this time. They wanted to get it right. And there was something very similar in Athens. Paul, you'll remember, walks around the city, sees that there are so many gods there. In fact, Athens was known for its multiplicity of gods, shrines, altars. In fact, there was a saying that it was easier to find a god in Athens than a man. And the city was named, of course, after the goddess Athena, who lived in the Parthenon up on the Acropolis. And there's a story about the unknown god, Agnosto Theo. In Greek folklore, centuries before Paul arrived in the city, Athens was suffering from a terrible plague, and the people were crying to all the gods, but they all failed to bring relief. And eventually, they reluctantly sent for a prophet in Crete. Now, Crete was despised, and the prophet was called Epimenides, but they had no choice. They were in a desperate position, so they sent for him. And he came, and he offered sacrifices to a god, and the plague stopped. But he refused to give them the name of the god. In fact, he only asked that there would be a peace treaty between Athens and Crete. And so from there on, the people made lots of little altars to an unknown god. That's where it came from. Luke would have known this. Paul would have known this. Oh, and when Paul, writing to Timothy, says something he wouldn't dare say today, or he'd end up in big trouble. Even one of their own prophets has said, Cretans are always liars, evil brutes, lazy gluttons, and this testimony is true. Well, it was Epimenides that actually said that in the first place, and he was a Cretan. So this is actually known as the liar's problem, because if Epimenides was one of their prophets, and all of them are liars, is what Epimenides said about the Cretans true or not? You can talk about that among yourselves later. That doesn't need to bother us now. All over our country, we have town councils. A bit boring, isn't it? You can go where you like, and you have a town council. It wasn't like that in the New Testament times. Wherever you went, they had different names. In Philippi, they were called strategoi. Now, it doesn't come across in our English necessarily so well because they have to put some kind of alternative in. But in Ephesus, they were called Asiakon. And in Malta, it was the Protos who was in charge. And in Thessaloniki, it was the Politarchus. And Luke gets them always in exactly the right place. He always knows exactly where the words to use. In fact, if you look at this, this is a Roman arch in Thessalonica that was demolished in 1876, and this inscription was rescued. The first word is politarkunton, which is to act as a politarch, exactly what Luke, the word Luke uses in Acts 17. Remember, Ramsey said Luke's history is unsurpassed in respect of his trustworthiness. When Paul arrived in Corinth, he met up with two dear folk, Aquila and Priscilla, a husband and wife team, who had been ordered out of Rome by Claudius. That is a statement that is well attested. Luke made it, and it was absolutely correct, and we have lots of information that he ordered the Jews out of Rome, and he ordered them out of Rome because it seems they were causing trouble. The Jews were causing trouble. At this time, there were some 13 Jewish synagogues in Rome. Could have been as many as 40,000 Jews, and Claudius was troubled by this number. But the Roman historian Suetonius says that since the Jews constantly made disturbance on the instigation of Christus, many believe that this is Christ, he expelled them from Rome. So already the gospel was having an impact in Rome. And Gallio was the proconsul in Achaia in Greece. And on this inscription, you have exactly that Gallio was proconsul in Greece at this time, trying to settle quarrels among the citizens. So this inscription says, and that's exactly what you find in the Acts of the Apostles. Now we'll skip over Artemis. She caused a riot, of course, as you know, in Ephesus, because Demetrius and his silversmiths were losing money to the gospel, as so many people were converted. But I love to add this from that magnificent temple, white marble with 100 columns. This is all that remains of Diana's temple in Ephesus today. One column in a muddy pool. And where is Paul's gospel? All over the world. So, on to Jerusalem. Did you notice in Acts that wherever Paul is, there seems to be riots? Well, it wasn't his fault at all. Paul had been seen in the city with a guy called Trophimus, and Trophimus was a Greek, a Gentile. And it was, the rumor got around, fake rumor again, that Paul had taken him into the temple area. And that's what the riot was all about. You see, that was a no-no for any non-Jew to go into the temple area. Was, well, it would be by pain of death. This inscription, which was actually discovered in Jerusalem, is an inscription that actually reads the warning that is given. Here it is. It was painted in red, by the way, in Greek, so that everybody could read it. No foreigner may pass this barrier and enclosure surrounding the temple. Anyone who is caught doing so will be himself to blame for his resulting death. That's what caused the riot. Now, Paul wasn't stupid enough. He hadn't taken Trophimus into the temple area at all, but the word got around that he had. But don't you think that it's exactly that Paul was referring to when he says in Ephesians 2:14 that Jesus has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility? Paul was taken into custody, rescued really from the Jewish mob by Claudius Lysias. Now notice again, you see that Luke gives the details. His name, his title, he's a tribune. That means he was in charge of a cohort. That was 1/10 of a legion. So he had 600 men. And by naming him, Luke allows his readers to check him out. You want to check it? You can easily go to the records and find out who the tribune was at the time Paul was taken into custody. And there's a number of other things in this little account that you need to note. There's a reference here to the Egyptian. Aren't you the Egyptian who some time ago led 4,000 terrorists into the desert? Paul was asked. Well, Josephus actually comments on this himself. And he says that there is a that there was an Egyptian, Ben Sada, he gives his name, and he led, he says, 30,000 out into a rebellion. Now, Luke's 4,000 is much closer to the reality. 30,000 would be more than the entire military legions in Palestine at that time. So there was this Egyptian revolt. We know about that. The assassination plot is well known for the Sicarii, like the Zealots, the assassination people. They'd already dispensed with one high priest that they didn't like, and they're the ones that were behind this assassination plot. And when we come to the escort to Caesarea, it fits perfectly what we know. The tribune ordered 200 infantry, 70 cavalry, and 200 lightly armed spearmen. That were the 3 divisions of Roman military. He gets it perfectly correct. Heavy infantry, cavalry, lightly armed spearmen. And they had a journey of around 70 miles to go from Jerusalem to Caesarea on the coast. They left at night, and they knew apparently exactly where the Sicarii were hiding, because they stopped halfway and they spent the remainder of the night, what was left of it, halfway, and then at Antipatris, and they carried on the next morning, just the cavalry. So they knew that the Sicarii were going to be hiding on that first, roughly speaking, 40 miles of the journey. You say, wasn't that a long journey for the poor old infantry one night? Not for a Roman legionary. A Roman legionary fast route march could cover 23 miles in 5 hours with a 70-pound pack on his back with his weapons. That's 31 kilograms, and you take about 20 into the cabin luggage of an airplane. So you carry that for 23 miles in 5 hours. Oh, and they can go faster than that as well if they have to. They were tough. They put our Marines to shame. But no more than that. Let's move on. We're coming to the close of Paul's life, the journey to Rome. Again, you see, notice how carefully Luke provides the names of the Roman officers and their rank. A cohort of officer couriers for communication between the emperor and the army, and Julius was a centurion. He even gives us the name of the regiment of the imperial cohort. The details are all there. And they embarked. And this is one of the most fascinating parts of the whole account of Paul's journey. Approximately, this is the kind of merchant ship that they would have gone on, probably carrying wheat, actually, with the passengers and prisoners as well. Now, this is a book you will never have read, and I don't really blame you. The Voyage and Shipwreck of Paul, 1848. 370 pages of it by James Smith. Who's James Smith, you may well ask? James Smith was 60 years a professional sailor, educated at Glasgow University, a scholar in Greek, Latin, and many languages, a student of geology and archaeology, and an authority on ancient ships and shipping. And although he died a long time ago, he still is that authority. And Luke's account of the journey and the shipwreck is considered the finest piece of eyewitness account of a shipwreck ever recorded, and accurate in every detail. This book is recognized by all academics of New Testament studies if they know it exists, and they should do, because you can still buy it today. And if you're really interested, you can download it and read it. You don't have to buy it. I downloaded it free. The Smith's book is a masterpiece and a perfect vindication of Luke's accurate work as a historian. It's considered to be one of the finest examples of a study of a biblical event. Luke uses the correct seaman's terminology, even though he didn't understand why an action should be taken. He wrote it down because he saw it was being done. Now, this is what Smith concluded. It's worth me reading it in full. No sailor would have written in a style so little like that of a sailor. However, no man not a sailor could have written the narrative of the sea voyage so consistent in all its parts, unless from actual observation. He even analyzes, by the way, the words Luke uses and shows that they were precisely the nautical language that would have been used. This peculiarity of style, to me, Smith goes on, in itself is a demonstration that the narrative of the voyage is an account of real events written by an eyewitness. A similar remark may be made on the geographical details. They must have been taken from an actual observation, for the geographical knowledge of the age was not such as to enable a writer to be so minutely accurate in any other way. You see, Smith had the advantage of modern charts, as they were in the 19th century. Luke could never have had that. There were no such things, no minute, accurate charts, but his detail is phenomenal. Luke's account and Smith's detailed analysis are of the greatest significance. If this is the character of Luke as a historian, then his gospel and the rest of Acts must be held with equal respect. Do you remember what Sir William Ramsey said? You may press the words of Luke in a degree beyond any other historians, and they stand the keenest scrutiny and the hardest treatment. Christianity did not originate in a lie, and we can and ought to demonstrate this as well as believe it. But isn't it strange, for all that, the way he concludes, the way he finishes? Because Luke has an anticlimax. It just stops. For 2 whole years, Paul stayed there in his own rented house and welcomed all who came to see him. Boldly and without hindrance, he preached the kingdom of God and taught about the Lord Jesus Christ. And go on, Luke. But that's all we read. Why? Why did Luke end there? Well, no one knows for certain. There are many theories. I needn't go into them now. But one of them, Tertullian, one of the Christian leaders writing around 200 AD, wrote that Paul had a similar death to that of John the Baptist, who was beheaded. Well, there are many theories why Luke finished there. It could be that all the Acts of the Apostles was a defense of Paul's life and ministry. It could be, very simply, that he wanted to close not on the negative of Paul the martyr, but on the positive of preaching the kingdom of God and teaching about the Lord Jesus Christ. In his gospel, Luke spends 1 whole chapter reporting the resurrection of Jesus as a literal, historical, real event. This, from the man whose accounts have been proved accurate wherever they have been tested. For 2,000 years, Christians, with good reason, have been prepared to die for their certainty that Jesus is alive. They were unashamed and unafraid, and many died in the arenas, burnt on the stakes, gored by wild animals. And 2,000 years later, nothing has changed. So, why are Christians prepared to die for a Jesus who was buried 2,000 years ago? If you go, as some of you will have done, to the Garden Tomb in Jerusalem, it's not where Jesus was buried, but it's very similar. You go into the tomb and see where the body would have been laid, and as you turn around and come out, there is a message on the inside of the door. He is not here, for he is risen. The resurrection of Jesus Christ demonstrates who he is and what he came to do. Or, as the Apostle Paul put it when he was writing to the Corinthians, Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. He was buried and he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures. We're coming up to Easter, and here is a little 44-page A6 full-color booklet. Is it true, the resurrection of Jesus? It's one of a series of 5 booklets. And if you want to give it to someone, it's a very easy book to give to people to demonstrate the reasons why we believe the resurrection of Jesus. Easy to read, simple to understand, and we hope it would clinch the whole issue in the minds of many. But if you want something much bigger, you've got Evidence for the Bible, which actually produces 250 pages of over 200 color pictures showing the many, many areas where archaeology demonstrates the truthfulness of the biblical record. But the other book, which is a biggie with some 700 pages in it and answering most of the questions you will ask about the Bible, another big book, but I do recommend it because it has a lot in it that you can use if you want to read through the Bible. In 18 months, it'll give you a program to do it. If you want a quick reference to so many details that you can't remember in the Bible, who wrote the books, when were they written, when was all the books gathered together in one Bible, this will answer your questions.